Hello. Hello. Gotta work on my camera angle here. Can you all hear me? Mic check. Check, check. Can you hear me? Check, check. This is a sarcasm-free zone. How's everybody doing? Anxiously dabbing. What am I drinking here?
LaCroix and Tito's.
Tonight I am drinking raspberry.
Cran raspberry.
I'm drinking cran raspberry LaCroix.
You're welcome.
LaCroix. And Tito's vodka.
You're welcome.
Thank you to my lovely girlfriend for making me a drink. Whew, it's been a long day. You know what I did today? I folded towels. Hard work. All right. Hello and welcome to Nightmare Masterclass. My name is David Stockdale. I will be your host on this excursion into the dark unknown. In this very special live installment, I'll be discussing the classic sci-fi horror film They Live, directed by John Carpenter. This is a film that has a very special place in my heart, right here. If only for the reason that the lead actor is Roddy Piper, who is... I very quickly looked him up on Wikipedia the other day, just because I was curious to read up on a famed pro wrestling legend, and turns out, he's one of the greatest heels in the history of professional wrestling. Someone says, the only time I've seen They Live, I was on lots of acid. I would say that's not a great time to watch the movie. I'm curious to hear about your experience, and I am wondering if you are still with us. Are you still here? Are you still functioning? I hope so. Some people never come back. So They Live is also just like a totally ridiculous film in some ways, and the dialogue is pretty great. My favorite line is when he's in the bank and an alien is reporting back to the base or whatever, and Piper aims his shotgun at him and says, "Mama don't like tattletales." It's a great line. So anyway, I'm gonna offer my impressions of the film. I recently just watched it again after not having seen it for a few years. I'm expecting to maybe go off on a tangent or two, but I would hope that you're used to that at this point. I have some people comment on my live streams and they're like, why do you go off on so many tangents? You got to stay focused. And I'm like, you know what a live stream is with me? It's like asking a dog not to chase balls, you know? So, I mean, so I do have a few broader analytical points to make about the film. I think I think this film is worth talking about in an analytical context, and I will be keeping my eye on the chat, and so I'll probably open it up to questions and a broader discussion towards the end of the stream. I expect this to go on for about, I don't know, maybe an hour. Yeah, that sounds about right. So let's get going. I've already had a couple glasses of wine. The branding of this wine was like it was very goth. It was very on brand. What's it called?
Apothic? Like winery?
Apothic. That is it's pretty good wine. It's not super expensive, you know. I'm not a wine connoisseur. I'm not a beer connoisseur. I'm not a snob. I'll drink whatever. I don't care. I have this whiteboard. I've had this whiteboard since college. I don't write anything on it ever. I don't know why I still have it. Just FYI. All right. So where do we start with this film? I mean, it is a very campy movie in some ways, but it is also it's based on a story called 8 o'clock in the morning, which is a story that I've never read. Have any of you read it? I wonder if it's any good. Yeah, I don't know. But I would say, you know, I would suggest to you that the protagonist, this John Nada, occupies a thematically significant position in this fictional universe. Much has been made of the fact that his nada means nothing in Spanish. He's a drifter. He has nothing to sell, but, like, you know, he's got his tools. He could sell the shirt off his back, although he probably wouldn't get much for it. But primarily, he has nothing to sell but his labor, right? And that's the name of the game at the beginning of this movie is he's trying to find a job. Very early on in the film, Nada enters like it's either an employment agency or like an unemployment office or something like that, and you can hear this lady. If you're paying attention, you can hear this lady over the intercom say something like, "Due to a computer error, the food stamp program has been suspended until further notice." And then a woman tells him there are no jobs currently available, and he says he's from Denver, and he recently moved, and all the jobs have dried up in Denver, and he mentions that 14 banks have closed in the span of a month, so it seems like some kind of economic crisis is happening. So the film the film very clearly establishes a certain theme, if you will, uh, the oppression of the working class. And though the cause of this situation is not entirely clear, right? But like there are various indications towards the beginning of the film as to what is going on. A street preacher alludes to a vague sort of conspiracy. He asserts that a group of malevolent figures have corrupted like the human spirit or something along those lines. And then Nada meets his friend Frank, who doles out a bit of wisdom and says, you know, the golden rule: he who has gold makes the rules. So, you know, and then a bearded man cuts into like a TV signal with a message, and he says that humans have all been induced into some kind of hypnotic state, lulled into a trance, which causes us to focus on our own to focus on our own narrow self-interest, right? Like we've all been sort of brainwashed into being narcissistic. There's a scene in the film where Nada he's going to sleep in like an alley, and he's looking into somebody's window as a woman as she's watching TV, and an actress is basically giving this very melodramatic dialogue where she's or I guess it would be a monologue where she's talking about how she's just become like it's just very narcissistic. She's become like obsessed with herself and fame and all this. There's a sense, it's like a spiritual point that everyone has sort of lost track or become out of touch with what's really important in life, and they become consumed with themselves in some way. And but the culprit is not entirely clear at this point. You know, like the preacher refers to, you know, it's not, and he doesn't have anything specific that he's saying at this point, and the man on the TV just kind of refers to whoever the culprit is as they or them, very vague terms. So there's a very clear urge to resist this message, right? Like the two guys watching the TV when the signal is interrupted are swearing at the TV, and they even seem to manifest physical symptoms, like they both get headaches. So there's like a physical discomfort at the thought or the possibility that how they see the world is not actually how it is in reality. They actually experience physical discomfort at that. Yeah. One thing I realized watching this again is that it is fairly slow paced at the beginning of the movie, just based on modern day standards. I forgot how long it actually takes for him to get the glasses. It takes that takes place like a half an hour into the movie, which I guess if it's like the structure of a screenplay, that kind of makes sense. It's like an hour and a half long movie, so a third of the way in is when he actually gets the glasses from the church and puts them on, and he's able to see like the underlying messages, these like commands or imperatives and they're in various forms of media, like billboards, magazines, and advertisements. You know, one of the billboards says "marry and reproduce," which yes, that's a good X post, good cross post for Valentine's Day. And there are a whole lot of other very entertaining messages that come across through these advertisements and on the TV and signs on the store. They say like obey, consume. One of them says no independent thought. And then he goes to a magazine stand, and there's a guy paying for like a newspaper or something. And on the dollar bill, it says, "This is your God." So this is my kind of movie. These like upper class cosmopolitan figures are revealed to be like these ghoulish looking alien creatures. And a politician on the TV is revealed to be an alien as well, which is funny because he's regurgitating the sort of rhetoric that Reagan has been associated with, like it's morning in America, a very like optimistic message. And this is kind of where the film starts to get comical. Like the reactions of Rowdy Roddy Piper are just gold at this point. But moving on into like a broader sort of analysis of the film. So this is something I think the film touches on with this whole dynamic where you put on a pair of sunglasses and you see like hidden or implicit messages behind various forms of media. It has to do with psychoanalysis. So the goal of psychoanalysis, in very simple terms, is to make you aware of certain unconscious processes going on, to make you aware of things that drive your behavior, that you have not been immediately that has not been immediately made apparent. You know, that's Freud's thesis, is that there are unconscious things going on that you're not aware of that drive your behavior. So the goal of psychoanalysis is to make you aware of that so you can observe certain behavioral patterns and sort of address them and kind of take control of your own narrative in your life. Obviously, I'm not a psychoanalyst, so you're getting a layman's perspective here, but that's the best summary I can give. But anyway, so that's psychoanalysis, but there's a great lecture by the late Rick Roderick who in which he says the goal of mass culture is psychoanalysis in reverse. In other words, making various processes of which you are immediately aware recede back into your unconscious in a way, so like making them automatic so that you're unaware of the processes that are occurring, right? So, you know, like you see an advertisement and ideally you don't know, or you aren't immediately aware of the modus operandi, so to speak. You're just enamored with whatever it is they want you to buy. That's the goal, right? I'm gonna take a drink here. Pyros Hans says, when I was an edgy 19-year-old, I used to write "This is your God" on minor euro bills for a while. Good times. That does sound like good times. You sound like a cooler 19-year-old than I was. I was not doing edgy stuff like that. So, like, the dubious nature of advertising is a very obvious theme in They Live. On that note, I want to talk about this historical figure. His name is Edward Bernays. Has anyone ever heard of Edward Bernays? He was a public relations pioneer, nephew to Sigmund Freud, and he worked for the U.S. government during World War I as a propagandist, essentially. And after his time in the war, Bernays said, I decided that if you could use propaganda for war, you could certainly use it for peace. And, of course, propaganda, the term propaganda, kind of had a stigma attached to it because the Germans used propaganda. And so all the Americans saw the propaganda that Germans were using, and there was a negative connotation attached to the term propaganda. So Bernays came up with the term public relations, counselor of public relations, which it was just propaganda for private corporate interests, basically. And one of the most impressive feats Bernays accomplished was convincing women that smoking cigarettes was some kind of emancipatory act, some kind of liberatory, pro-feminist act, I would strongly suggest watching the Adam Curtis documentary. I don't know why I said it like that. Century of the Self, if you are not familiar. It's an entire documentary series on YouTube, and it goes in a way more depth than I could possibly do right now about like Edward Bernays and public relations and advertising and all that. And I would pretty much, I would recommend anything that Adam Curtis has done. I've seen Hypernormalization and Bitter Lake. Those are two, I believe those are all on YouTube. So look them up. So at a certain point, there was a shift in the zeitgeist of advertising. There was like a transition from the sort of ad that appeals to logic, that appeals to like reason, and basically makes a case for the product in a very straightforward fashion. There was a shift from that to the sort of ad that sells a lifestyle rather than just a product, that appeals to kind of your emotions in simplistic terms. It sells like a lifestyle, sort of inculcating the product into a framework in which people view it as essential to a certain desirable way of living. And you still do see elements of these straightforward commercials to some degree. Like for instance, you might see like a commercial for laundry detergent where they're pitting their product against their rival product, and they're showing how their product is clearly superior. This is kind of like the old school way of advertising, because it just appeals to you on a rational basis. Like you watch the commercial and you're like, well, clearly this one's better because they're pitting the two against one another, and you see which one is superior. And so those ads are essentially the same ones you would see in like the 50s or the 60s. They haven't really changed that much. But there has been a very clear shift, and those ads are maybe for certain types of products. Those types of ads are still appropriate, but more and more we're seeing like lifestyle branding has become the dominant mode of advertising, and there's all sorts of ideological baggage in modern day ads that in some cases are so obvious that it kind of seems parodic, right? It almost seems like a joke, but I'd say this is when it's done poorly. When it's done effectively, commercials trick you into not fully realizing that you are watching a commercial, if only just for a fleeting moment, you know? Yeah. Fargosis from YouTube says, Marlboro cigarettes was the first to sell a lifestyle with wholly manly cowboy imagery. And since cigarettes had high brand loyalty, and since it was hashtag cool to smoke, if you wanted to sell cigarettes, you had to get the new smokers to build that lifestyle sale, that lifetime sale. Right. Exactly. It's like investing in a customer, investing in a consumer. Once you have them sold, you might well have them sold for life. So that's just a huge line of revenue, and it's consistent because, how often do people buy cigarettes? Pyros Hans says, smoking working class cigarettes instead of bourgeoisie cigars is a performance in itself, boys. Yeah. Advertising history is surprisingly very interesting. It's not something, at least for me, everyone hates to watch commercials, right? But the history of advertising is fascinating. Anyway. Oh. All right. Let's talk for a minute about the 6-minute fight scene between Nada and his buddy Frank. Okay. So, I'm an older millennial. So most of my pop culture references pre like the mid 90s are secondhand. Like mostly like I got my pop culture references from The Simpsons. Like when The Simpsons would do a parody of something, that's where I would know something from the 80s or the 70s from, but this ridiculously long fight scene was parodied in South Park. So that's where I initially recognized it from. That's like being a millennial is strange because you get all your pop culture references from secondhand. You get all of them from like parodies before you actually experience the original source of it. So it's weird. I don't know. Is there a term for that? I guess it's the postmodern condition, maybe. But anyway, Slavoj Žižek has a good take on this fight scene in his film, The Pervert's Guide to Etiology. So if you can tolerate Žižek, which I know some people cannot, but if you can, I would recommend watching that. That's probably one of his better, one of the optimal Žižek experiences is the film Pervert's Guide to Etiology, because he basically inserts himself into these movies and then talks about like psychoanalysis and politics and all that. But he basically says that this very long fight scene represents the struggle when one's ideological perspective is challenged. So that kind of explains the length and the absurd kind of brutality of the fight scene. Because it's Frank is just adamantly opposed to putting on these glasses. It's kind of like a good metaphor that represents when someone is very has dug into their position and they're not willing to see other perspectives, But this is more of a meta, I don't know, a meta conversation about just talking about films. But let's shift gears here just for a second. There's this kind of pervasive notion when it comes to film analysis or art or whatever. There's this idea that one needs to derive a cohesive quote unquote message from a work. But that's a strange thing to me, to say that art communicates with us in this way. When we use the term communicate, it refers to two or more parties conveying messages to one another in such a way that we know these messages have been received because we get some sort of acknowledgement, right? There's kind of a there's a back and forth, but I don't believe that art communicates with us in this clear and direct way. And that's kind of what defines it as art. Engaging with art is always an interpretive exercise. So that's something to keep in mind, I think. And so talking about They Live, They Live contains certain contradictions that I think are worth parsing out. For instance, you might say that the film lays bare the very cunning sort of the very cunning types of propaganda that appear in late capitalism, like the underlying market logic of the world in a capitalist framework that's fully industrialized. But I think also it is very obvious that there is a reactionary aspect to the film that is worth discussing as well. There's a conspiratorial element that I think is kind of indicative of far right-wing ideology in certain respects. We could perhaps even say that it has a kind of anti-Semitic undertone, But that is not to say that I think the film fully embodies this ideological perspective or buys into its own narrative in a wholesale fashion. I don't think art communicates with us in such a clear and precise way. And it would be kind of obtuse to think that the film's premise should be taken in literal terms, right? There's very clearly a tongue-in-cheek aspect to the work. It kind of nods at the viewer and sort of acknowledges that the premise is absurd, right? The premise in this case being, of course, that aliens have orchestrated a mass delusion. Sorry, I had to burp. right, there's like a tongue-in-cheek aspect to the work. It's very campy. Um, so there's like a tension between the premise, this like alien conspiracy against the human race, and like the antithesis of this premise, which is simultaneously more banal and more even more horrific than the actual premise. So the antithesis would be that humans have done this. We've done this to ourselves, right? There's no alien conspiracy. There's no like other group with like a set of intrinsic or immutable traits that leads them to operate in this manner. It's all us. It's all on us. And of course, there is most definitely a ruling class, right? But that's due to the dynamics of our economic system. I mean, I would consider the U.S. to be an oligarchy. I don't think that's a controversial claim. To say like that the rich have an undue and extremely disproportionate influence on our government. And I read a study the other day that something like 60% of the wealth in the U.S. is inherited, meaning that the majority of these people haven't even accumulated this wealth themselves, right? They've inherited it. So the point being, this sort of outlandish premise that this alien conspiracy and they live works in service of an ideological antagonism that is fleshed out over the course of the film. So that's basically my thoughts. Yeah. I'll open it up to kind of a broader discussion now. If you have something to contribute or a question you'd like to ask, it doesn't even necessarily have to be related to the film. If you just want to shoot the shit, that's cool with me. I'll be like focusing my full attention on the chat. So let's do it. Pyrohan says, escaping from a platonic cave and returning to the chained masses with your personal enlightenment and failing to convince them is exactly that fight. That is an astute observation, I would say. I'm not going to do a good job of paraphrasing what a platonic cave is right now, but I understand essentially what you're saying. I believe the idea is like that, you know, you're in a cave, there are shadows projected onto the wall. All you know is the cave, so all you've seen are these shadows, and this is all you know to be true. So when you're exposed to reality, it's kind of startling. Any tips for script writing for people trying to break into the YouTube essay scene? Whew, boy. I would say I don't know where to begin. It's hard to think of it pragmatic advice that doesn't kind of boil down to a cliche or a truism. A truism. But, you know, one of these things I would emphasize is really be honest, be true to yourself. If you don't know something, don't pretend like you know it, or better yet, like do research and kind of formulate a more informed opinion about the subject. Um, I mean, I can give you some just technical advice. What's really worked out for me on YouTube is I have a workflow. I have established kind of a consistent workflow, and personally for me, I'm a I'm kind of a procrastinator. So if there's something that's kind of arduous in the process, or something that I'm not, something I'm kind of putting off because it's difficult, um, the nice thing about YouTube is there are a few different components to making a YouTube video. And I know everybody says that you should write your script first, but me personally, I make my own music, so if I get sick of writing my script, I will work on my music. And it's sort of a feedback loop. Like, working on my music kind of helps get my brain going so that I can have more energy to put into the writing process. And, you know, there are other components as well. Like, you can always gather imagery that you want to use for your video. You can make your thumbnail. And so there's all these different components that go into making a YouTube video. And I would say the sky's the limit. Don't limit yourself to any one thing. Whoa, that was loud as shit. I'm going to turn that down. But anyway, you get what I'm saying. You can kind of, like, I hate this term, but you can kind of do a life hack here, where if you get sick of one part of the process, you can always work on another until you're kind of recharged. That's what I do. I don't know if that helps, but yeah. Oh, what time zone are you in? I am in Central Standard Time. So, yeah. It is 4 o'clock in the morning in my part of Europe. Well, wow. Greetings from the Midwest of the United States. I hope everything is going well in your part of the world. I hope things aren't going to shit. You know, it is what it is. I have not seen The Book of Eli. That's a movie, right? I don't know. Okay. More so a question. This is a question from Christopher S. More so a question relating to the concept of a film. What do you think are the main causes of political works falling into quote unquote "we live in a society" territory, and how can they be avoided? So, if you're not familiar, "we live in a society" is kind of like a shorthand, like a pithy phrase that you're kind of making fun of someone who is pontificating about the world and maybe kind of overgeneralizing in a very pretentious sort of way. Which let's Let's be honest. I've definitely done that before. It's okay. Um, I think this is a pitfall for writers who have maybe not entirely focused what it is that they want to talk about. Um, they don't have a fully fleshed out idea of the precise subject of whatever it is they're writing about, and so they start pontificating and they start overgeneralizing. Um, as to advice for how that can be avoided, um, it's hard to speak in general terms. What I would say is, I mean, if it's you that and you're trying to write something, don't force it. Don't try to force it. If you really are just sitting there scratching your head and you're not sure what you should write about, I would say go do something else. And if you're able to, when that moment of inspiration strikes, and I assure you it will, because that's how our brains work. I mean, if you have your heart set on writing something, and you operate with that mentality, just give it some time. Just live your life, and there will come a moment where you feel like you have something to say. And I think the important thing is when that moment comes, write it down. Whatever you're doing, wherever you are, write it down. And then you have something you have something to start with, and you can start fleshing that out, and you can start elaborating on whatever it is you're doing. That's my pragmatic advice. I would say if you're really just sitting there scratching your head, go do something else. Don't worry about it. Go live your life. Go have a life experience. And then, maybe you're in the shower one day and you think of an idea. The important thing is when you think of the idea, write it the fuck down. That's my advice. Hope that helps. Okay. Steven says, I know that it's a movie, so it needs to be written in a way that the story can unfold. But how dumb are the aliens for leaving their single transmitter on an unguarded roof? Well, I mean, it's not entirely unguarded. There are a bunch of helicopters that come up at the end. And there are aliens everywhere. But another thing is that if you're watching this movie, you do kind of get the sense that like Roddy Piper and the co-star, his buddy Frank, are basically operating on like God mode throughout the entire movie. Like they're just going around impervious to damage until the very end. So I would say the aliens is kind of like stacked up against them. I mean, that's what I would say. But yeah, leaving one single source of where the signal is transmitting from, kind of a poor strategic move on the part of the aliens. Yeah, you are correct. Do you feel like the audience surrogate has been replaced pseudo-sentient defense dialogue? I have no fucking idea what you're talking about. You're going to have to elaborate. But that sounds like an interest. Whatever you're getting at, that sounds interesting. So, with respect to future plans for my channel, I'm probably going to take a break next week. Just a heads up. So I most likely will not have a new video for you next week. But hopefully, like 2 weeks from now, I'll have a new one, and it will be fairly long. I think it'll be about half an hour. I'm not sure if I'm ready to reveal exactly what the topic is. We'll see how it goes. Thoughts on that new Alan Resnick short, Let Me Inside? I'm not sure what the fuck to think of that. So he just goes around and he's like a cowboy, and he just goes inside a couple's house and starts like taking a tour of their house. I have no idea what to make of that. I will watch anything with Alan Resnick in it because he is just a uniquely funny little guy. I like his little bath videos where he's taking a bath and talking about various things. But I don't know what to make of Let Me Inside or whatever it was called. Yeah. Maybe I'm missing something important there. I don't know. Pyros Hans is asking, would you consider making a video essay on the Australian classic Picnic at Hanging Rock? It would be a superb Valentine's Day horror topic in my book. I have not heard of that movie. Have you heard of that movie?
Nope.
I'll have to check that out. Thank you for the suggestion. The best part about having a YouTube channel is I get a bunch of off-the-wall suggestions that I probably never would have heard of otherwise. That sounds vaguely familiar, but I have not seen that movie. Picnic at Hanging Rock. Replaced with... Oh, okay. I think I understand what you're saying. Silver KM03. Do you feel like the audience surrogate has been replaced? Pseudo sentient defense replaced with... I think I'm back on.
Back on, yeah.
Sorry, folks. My internet cut out for a second. I don't know exactly where I got cut off at, but Andrew Millar says, I saw a plausible discussion that May I Please Enter was an allegory on the intrusiveness of social media. So now that you say that, that sounds plausible. Thank you for pointing it out. I'm going to watch it again with that in mind and see see what I have to say about that. That sounds plausible. Yeah, the aliens interrupted my signal. I think that's exactly what happened. I was telling the truth too much for a second. there. Ooh. Y'all like these glasses here? I think it's like evokes El Dia de los Muertes. They're cute. Well, it's been about an hour. I'm kind of out of energy at this point. Thank you, everybody, for watching. Thanks, everyone. That wraps it up for this installment of Nightmare Masterclass. Just a quick reminder that if you enjoy my videos and have a few bucks to spare, you can consider supporting me on Ko-fi.com/Nightmare Masterclass. For some reason, I sometimes pronounce it Ko-fi, like hi-fi or lo-fi. I think it kind of lends itself to that mispronunciation. So I don't know what to tell you. It's Ko-fi. I've been told it's Ko-fi, like coffee. Ko-fi.com/Nightmare Masterclass. Obviously, I don't expect any huge donations from anyone. I am overwhelmed when someone gives me like over $10. I really do appreciate it, but I do not expect that level of. I don't expect that level of support. And obviously, if you are not in a position where you can spend any money, please do not worry about it. I don't want to make anyone feel put upon. But yeah, I do appreciate it. Any amount of money I get. Anyway. All right. Well, I think that does it for this installment. Thanks for watching, and have a good night, everyone.